Alright, cool. It's Nolly from GGD, and I wanted to do a really quick video to expound on something which I was talking with Jordan from the Hardcore Music Studio YouTube channel in a live chat that we did a couple of weeks ago. I was referring to using FabFilter's Saturn plugin to drastically reduce the amount of cymbal bleed in live drum tracks. Saturn, if you don't know what it is, it's a multi-band distortion saturation plugin. You wouldn't think that this would be a great tool for reducing bleed, but in addition to having lots of different saturation modes, it's got a load of other features, including a little 4-band EQ. It's got this kind of feedback thing, a mix control, a drive control, but then it has this really, really important control here called dynamics. Now, what I understand about dynamics is that if you turn it anti-clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on your dialect of choice, it just functions as like a gate/expander, basically. If you go to the right, it's like a pumping style compression. I can only imagine that this is based on the same code that FabFilter used for their Pro G gate, but it's just a one knob solution, and whatever they've done just works incredibly well if you use it as a multi-band gate. Now, some people might have seen me talking about using FabFilter's multi-band compressor called Pro MB to do this. I shared my workflow for that when I did my Nail the Mix course and also the Creative Live course that I did. Saturn has overtaken that for a couple of reasons. It's overtaken it, probably the most predominant reason is it sounds great and it's just a single control. Like I said, don't know what they did in terms of the time constants, the ratio, there's lots of things you could tweak with the gate, but this has no latency. It's not going to really look ahead, obviously. And you don't have to think about anything other than just how much or how little of the effect that you want. I should also maybe just mention that I've been using Saturn for a long time for bass distortion, for general kind of distorting and saturating things. But I got into using it more on drums, having seen Eric Valentine's video. I think it's a couple of videos actually where he's running through mixes and talking about using Saturn to emulate the high frequency saturation that you get recording to tape that he really likes. As in it kind of adds interesting harmonics and also smooths transient response at the same time as you're boosting high end into it. So that was something which I used a little bit. I talked about using it on Tom's when we did the P4 mix run-throughs in the P4 library on the GGD channel, which you can also find. But using that, I was finding I was bringing out some more cymbal bleed in the process, as kind of boosting that high end, and I thought I'd see what that dynamics knob would do. And it started out with little small moves, and then one day I was tracking a band live in the studio, live drummer recording in the studio, and I just thought I'd use that on a more extreme setting since it's no latency, just to cut some of the bleed so everyone can hear a nicer sound. And I was really shocked at how good it sounded. Now, for me, it wasn't necessarily something which I thought I was sharing like a huge secret, but it seems like when I talked about this in the podcast, lots of people really latched onto it, have been trying it out and are really blown away with the results. So I thought it'd be good to just kind of talk through in a little bit more detail what this is about. So I've pulled up some drum raws that I happen to have on my computer at the moment. It's for a project I'm mixing, a really cool duo debut album for a band called Matter in Motion. I actually tracked this 4 years ago, certainly pre-COVID. Mike Mallion from the band Monuments played session drums on this, did an incredible job. I thought this would be a good case scenario because I actually did saturate the drums a little bit more than I typically do during the recording, and I also boosted some extra high end into the snare drum, into the snare top mic really. So the bleed is a bit more apparent than it might otherwise be in my kind of more cleaner recording. So I'm just going to really quickly show you, before I explain in more detail, I'm just going to do an A-B comparison. I'm going to hit play, you're going to hear the snare top on its own, in its default state in Saturn, which is nothing happening. The drive is on 0, which is important because when you load up Saturn, the drive is automatically at 20%. So that's on 0. And then I'm going to flip to the B version, which has my kind of bleed killing thing on. Lastly, I'll just mention there is a limiter on the master channel. It's adding 3 dB of gain. We're not hitting that at all. I'm just making it a little bit louder. Very occasionally there might be a peak that gets stopped from going over by that, but that's not really affecting the sound of the snare at all. So here we go. Alright, so hopefully you'll agree that is an absolutely huge difference. The perception of the cymbal bleed is so reduced by this trick. So The dynamics knob is essentially kind of gating or expanding, so it's not going all the way to 0, but it's reducing the volume of the high frequencies above 1K, which is where I've got the crossover set to in this plugin, in between the hits. And it's just very intelligently, this is the magic. I don't know exactly how it's set under the hood, but it seems to have a really good idea of when the snare attack happens, it's allowing the high end to come through momentarily and very transparently disappearing again. So I find that has next to no impact on the character of the attack of the drum, which is very impressive considering there's no look ahead or latency. You know, if there's a tiny loss in the impact of the snare drum, it is far outweighed by the benefits of not having that bleed there for me. You know, you can transient designer, bit of EQ, bit of compression, whatever it is that you want to do to add more attack back into your drum if you feel like something's been lost. You don't have to turn that band all the way down to nothing. You know, just turn it down until it's sounding good. I'll demonstrate in a second what it sounds like as I'm tweaking it around. But just remember that if you can gain a few dB of headroom in terms of like your snare sound to cymbal bleed, signal to noise ratio, I guess, in the context of a mix, that is a really big win. It could take like a cymbal bleed from being this really annoying mono thing that you can hear kind of coming through the noise gate to being something that you really don't notice at all. So it doesn't need to be like literally eliminate every single vestige of cymbal bleed in there. And then, I mean, the final thing is every modern mixer is probably going to be compressing or transient designing their snare and then saturating it, and then it's going to go through a limiter on the master bus. So if there's a few percentage loss in terms of attack by doing this, I think it's absolutely inaudible in the context that it's going to be used in. So I'm going to hit play again. I'm going to move the crossover point around a little bit. You're hopefully going to see, you know, if I move the crossover point lower than 1K, we start to reduce the kind of area, which is, you know, that kind of like 300 up to 900 to 1K, where you get the overtones of the snare drum, which, you know, if you've got a really muffled, dampened drum, you might not notice. But if you have a drum that's got a bit of character in its ring, you're going to start kind of losing that if you move the crossover point down. You're going to lose it in the sustain, but there might still be some of those frequencies in the attack, which is getting through the gate. And I find that a little bit confusing when it then comes to EQing. So I prefer to leave this crossover around 1K, which is definitely getting rid of most of the cymbal, but certainly all the upper mids and top end of the cymbal bleed, but it's leaving some of the character in the lower ranges of the snare so that the sustain still sounds natural. So that's the crossover. I'm going to experiment with just moving the dynamics knob around a little bit so you can hear what that does. And then I'm going to bring in the snare bottom, because the snare bottom's got the wire sound. So if you blend a bit of that in, that pretty much entirely covers up any loss of high frequencies within the snare tone. So you immediately get back to a really really hi-fi sounding snare. So here we go. That would be an absolutely extreme setting there. If you wanted to show someone the power of this tool for getting rid of bleed, you could show them that. But I think that's started to approach the sound of a really hard gating, you know, just in general. There's a bit of sustain left in the tone, the low end of the snare. But for me, that's a pretty useless setting. So yeah, I find 1K just works really well. Set and forget, don't really need to think about it. And the knob kind of around 9 o'clock seems to do a really good job. Let's blend in that snare bottom. I was talking about that, wasn't I? It's like, yeah. With Saturn on, it's like you've just turned the cymbals down, or they've just been moved really far away from the snare microphone. So, yeah, that's the trick on snare. I guess I could also mention this tone sliders here you could use, especially, you know, in a tracking session, if you literally just want to use this like a channel strip, which is pretty much how I think of Saturn these days. It's like a really advanced multi-band channel strip. You could use it to bring out a bit of extra high end in the top end of the snare. You could potentially create another band in the mid range to reduce some of that kind of ringiness if you wanted to, or just kind of EQ it down. And you can also tighten up the low end a little bit, which sounds pretty cool. So I'm just going to do that. I'm not saying this is going to be a final snare sound, but this is the kind of thing you might want to do on a tracking session. Just have one plug-in kind of fix for making a snare drum sound awesome. Just such a great plugin. I love it more and more the more I use it. So that's using it on the snare drum. Let's check out the same thing on toms. So here in this session I've got the stripped versions of the toms. Let's just go back to the raw ones here. So again, this might be something you do in tracking. I would still strip the tracks because with this technique you're still going to hear the rumble of especially all the toms really, if they're tuned to have a bit of note to them. So that'll be kind of getting set off with every kick hit and whatnot. And especially if you've got a kit with more toms, this thankfully just has 2, but you know, if you had a kit that had 5 toms, then that's a lot of extra ring going on in the mix. Could be cool in the right context. If you're streaming, probably totally fine. Well, I think it is completely fine. Better that than to have a gate occasionally not allowing your lighter hits to come through. I did some playthrough videos for Matt Halpin of Periphery recently. Didn't use any gates on that, I just used this technique. So the toms are open, you can hear them rumbling if you really listen for it, but it's not really hurting anyone. Right, so let's just use this little section here that's got tom fill. Or maybe there's a better place, like over here. And here are a couple of instances of Saturn that I made earlier. It's the same thing, pasted across the 2. Here I have used the crossover a bit further down. You know, in this case, I don't really care about mid-range and the sustain of the toms. Let's just listen to the difference there. So I'll just bypass them quickly and then turn them on again. Cool, so I'll just switch back now to the stripped toms and you'll hear the difference. You know, with that on and silence in between the tom hits, it's like there's no bleed worth talking about. That's just going to be completely inaudible in the mix. This is completely raw drums, apart from a little bit of stuff which I did on the way in during the tracking session, and these Saturn instances. We can also try it on kick drum, you know, if you want to see what that's like. Just instantly. I mean, you don't really need, unless you've got a boomy kick drum that you want to tame with a gate, you don't need one. That will totally suffice. Finally, this drive knob at 20% that I mentioned earlier, it's really not a big deal to me. Unless you're throwing loads of level in, you're not going to hear that thing saturating. So I'll admit, well, all the time, I don't even bother turning that down to 0. I just did it for the purpose of this video, for those of you that might think that that's having some kind of negative impact on the sound. All right, so that's it. That is the Saturn trick for, I say it's a trick, you know, using Saturn to reduce the bleed on your drum tracks. It works equally well with the original version of Saturn. Maybe, I don't know if they adjusted the algorithm for the dynamics section there, but still sounds awesome in the original. So if that's the one you've got, it's going to work equally well. Sweet, enjoy. Hope this helps out on your drum recording processes, your streaming if you're a streaming drummer, I think this could be a really, really great tool to use. Yeah, hope you enjoy.